Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We tell ourselves stories in order to heal, processing grief through the written word. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan. I'm Director of Training and Education here at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. We're so grateful that you're all able to take the time to join us here today. This Compassion in Action webinar is a program of the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. We're a Boston-based nonprofit organization established in 1995. I hope many of you are familiar with our flagship program, the Schwartz Rounds, which is offered in hundreds of our member organizations around the world and provides caregivers from all healthcare professions with a forum for discussing the complex emotional experiences of caregiving. Before we get started, there are a few things I'd like to note about today's session. First of all, this special series of COVID-19 focused Compassion in Action webinars has been supported by the Coveris Community Healthcare Foundation and by a donation in memory of Julian and Eunice Cohen. We're so grateful for their support. Today's program is going to last for 60 minutes. So we'll have a presentation for about the first 45 minutes, and then that will be followed by a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. We encourage you to interact with our speakers and ask your questions, but all of you as attendees are participating in listen-only mode, and so you'll need to use the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel in order to ask your questions. Please do so, though. I also want to add that we know that so many of our colleagues are unable to join us here today, so we will be recording this session and posting it along with the presentation on our website tomorrow. Last but not least, as you exit the webinar, we'll have a very brief survey for you. If you would take a minute to fill it out, we'd appreciate it. We read every comment and we really appreciate your feedback on this session and this series. And now it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce my dear colleague and our host for today's session. Dr. Beth Lown is Chief Medical Officer here at the Schwartz Center and Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon. Thank you, all of you out there, for joining us for today's Compassion in Action webinar. I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Sunita Puri. Sunita is the Medical Director of the Palliative Medicine and Supportive Care Service at the Keck Hospital and Norris Cancer Center of USC. She's a Rhodes Scholar, has been, and she completed her medical training at UCSF and Stanford. She's also the author of an acclaimed literary memoir, That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour. And she's written for several journals, such as the New York Times and news outlets, the New York Times, the LA Times, Slate, and the journal The American Medical Association. In 2018, she received the Etz Chaim Award from the USC School of Medicine for faculty member who most embodies compassion and humanism in patient care. So we're just delighted that you're able to be with us here today, Sunita. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be a part of this webinar, and I hope that what I talk about today will be helpful to those of us who are facing a lot of distress and grief, both on the front lines and within our own lives and families. So first, I think we're going to start with a poll, which I believe Stephanie is going to take the role in.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Puri. So we're going to get started with a quick poll. Just to get a sense of who's on the line here today, we'd love for you to answer this question. What is your role at your healthcare organization? And so if you could just take a moment to fill that out. I know the buckets are a little bit funny. There were only 5 possible options, so we had to smush them together. But we'd love to know, of all of you on the line here today, are you a physician? Are you a nurse or an advanced practice nurse? Are you in PT, OT, respiratory therapy? Do you provide spiritual care? Are you a social worker? Are you an administrator or other? I know those are big categories. So we'll just give it another second and then we'll close the poll. Thanks everyone, fantastic participation. Okay, are you ready, Dr. Puri? Here are the results.
Wow, I'm really, really happy to see we've got a lot of spiritual care providers and social workers. We've got RNs and NPs. We've got some physicians and some PTOT respiratory therapists and some administrators as well. So what a great crowd. Thank you for joining. And if you could let us know in this next poll, what is your role at your healthcare organization? Actually, sorry, we already did that.
Sorry, I'm going to ask our producer on the back end to make sure the slides are going back into the display mode there, which I'm not seeing.
Small technical difficulty. We'll be right with you here.
Okay, John, I think this is not the first slide. Is it possible to back it up? And one more back. Okay, so I think the first slide is not presenting, but what I wanted to talk about is really what I'm hoping to do for all of you in this presentation today. We're really living in unprecedented times, both as individual human beings and members of families, but also as healthcare providers. And so what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is to talk about the various forms of grief that we are all facing collectively as human beings and on the front lines of patient care. I will often, you'll notice in the slides, refer to physicians because since I am a physician, I feel that's the most authentic lens I can present. But everything I'm saying applies equally to all healthcare providers on the front line, and I hope to all human beings. And what I'm interested in exploring in this presentation is how reading and writing can both be tools and even potentially rituals that we can turn to face the grief that we're all processing together. So I'm going to start with the story of my own. Sorry about that. When I was in residency, I cared for a patient with end-stage liver disease who was admitted to the ICU with SBP. I can still see his face in my mind, but I don't actually remember his name. He was bronzed in that way only jaundice can bronze a person, and he was so disoriented that he thought he was in Alaska and I was a polar bear. He had already been started on a number of life-saving interventions by a colleague of mine when I picked him up as my patient on the night shift. But as all of the hours passed, his blood pressure dropped further, his kidneys began to fail, and I called his family right away, who came in. And we sat together at this giant conference room table where they felt like they were multiple feet apart from me. I said to them, I don't think he's going to survive no matter what we do. But I was only a third-year resident. I wasn't an attending. And I wish I didn't have to ask the next question. If his heart stops, do you want us to do everything for him to stay alive? I swallowed hard, hoping beyond hope that they would say no. Say no, say no, say no, I silently begged them. You do anything it takes to keep him alive, his wife said, staring right into my eyes. My plea then changed to please don't code, please don't code, please don't code. But he did. And when the code pager jangled in my pocket, I knew it was him. 45 minutes. That's how long I compressed his chest, yelled out for labs to be drawn, and asked my medical student to keep time, screamed for all the looky-loos to get out of the room. Blood spurted rhythmically from his endotracheal tube, just in time with each compression. Feces were all over the floor and on my shoes. Time of death, 02:45, I said, hating myself more and more as each minute passed. I didn't sleep for the next week, ravaged by guilt and a sense of my own inadequacy. I couldn't talk about it with anyone, even though my attending offered to do so. I never went to any support groups or called a counselor. I suffered silently, avoiding connection with others, avoiding the ICU itself when my rotation ended. I tried to push thoughts of that night away from my mind, but every time the code pager went off, it all rushed back, even when I rotated to other hospitals. He appeared in my dreams and popped into my mind whenever a patient of mine was getting sicker. I realized months later that what I felt was not guilt anymore. It was grief. And it was only then that I could cry. I came across this passage from Joan Didion's really brilliant collection of essays called The White Album. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria which is our actual experience. As she reflects on in this passage, I was searching for some sort of meaning in my experience, some sort of redemption. I toggled between letting myself off the hook by saying, well, it was the family's choice, to lambasting myself as a physician. What sort of incompetent resident would even offer CPR and keep it going for 45 minutes? I needed to believe some sort of story about what had happened and what I had done. And for a long time, my story of grieving my patient's death was all about blaming myself. So what is grief? And this can be defined in so many ways, but I believe it is a reaction to profound loss. It's not just an emotional reaction. It can have profound physical, cognitive, and spiritual effects as well. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is famous for defining specific stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But it's really important to remember that these don't happen in a linear fashion, and you can continue to cycle through these various stages for a while. Grief is a process. It may be our companion throughout life, depending on the magnitude of our loss, and it can often be a lonely experience, as one of the common sentiments I've heard from many patients and families who feel they're isolated from a world that is moving forward while they feel stuck, reliving and trying to understand and come to terms with the loss of someone they love. And grief has many permutations. We can feel it in anything from the loss of a relationship, to our health being compromised, to the loss of a parent, to the loss of a patient, to even grieving our own inability to prevent suffering and our inability to save lives. So we have another poll for you at this point, and Stephanie is going to put the questions up.
Thanks, Dr. Puri. So we just want to sort of take a little survey to ask if among you in the group, have you experienced a greater amount of grief, however you interpret that, during the COVID pandemic? It's a simple one of yes or no. So let us know what you think. And then we will launch our results. Thank you, everyone. It's exciting to have such a large group on the line to weigh in on this. Great, we'll give it another 10 seconds. And then we'll close it up. And Dr. Puri, you can weigh in on what you see. We'll see if we're surprised. Okay, so let's see our results.
Wow, so 80% of people said, yes, you've experienced a greater amount of grief during the COVID pandemic, and 20% said no. Thank you guys so much for participating. This gives me a really good sense for who's going through what in the audience. I'm having trouble advancing to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about grief amid COVID-19. One of the things that distinguishes grief in this era from grief in the past is the universality of the grieving experience. We could say maybe in a quote unquote normal world, many people who have experienced loss feel they're grieving alone. But today we are collectively grieving many things: the loss of the world as we know it, the new possibility of sudden death, economic hardship, and the uncertainty of what our lives may look like moving forward. In medicine, we are witnessing situations we couldn't have imagined: losing patients quickly, witnessing particular forms of suffering and sudden death, feeling inadequate in our work due to the sheer volume and complexity of the patients presenting, and feelings of trauma, depression, and anxiety from what is being asked of us. We're also trying to support families of patients who cannot visit them, can't be with them in death, who suffer from a lack of ability to connect with them when they're in the hospital, and their own ongoing fear and uncertainty about the virus. We are collectively struggling with a lack of connection, anticipatory and complicated grief, and a sudden lack of ritual to help us in moments of grieving. Megan O'Rourke, who is a writer who wrote really beautifully in The Long Goodbye of the Loss of Her Mother, talked about what it is like to live with sorrow and how isolating it can be. In those first months, I quickly came to feel almost embarrassed by my sorrow. Most people are uncomfortable around loss. Friends talk to you about getting through it, moving on, and healing. I think this is part of why there are so many memoirs and movies about loss. They create a space where we can talk safely about grief. Even though we are collectively grieving and there's more open space to process what we're going through as care providers and also as human beings, it is turning it, we can perhaps find some degree of solace in reading and writing that we may not be able to find when we are with each other. I don't know how many of you have seen this photograph, but back in 2015, it was taken by an EMS member. And this is a physician who works in the ER and lost a 19-year-old patient that the EMS brought in. And this is a photo of him outside the hospital crying. And it was taken by one of the members of the EMS team. This photo, I think, went viral because it shows how privately physicians grieve, and all care practitioners. This wasn't necessarily a situation where this person may have felt he or she could grieve in front of others. And so we often hold it in, and particularly now with this lack of ritual to put our grief somewhere, we carry around an immense amount of suffering, which I would say is not necessarily different from the amount of suffering this young physician was carrying around back in 2015. There are studies of physician grief, which I think are generalizable to many other of the specialties. There's a study done by Dr. Granick in JAMA Internal Medicine back in 2012, and it was conducted in 3 Canadian hospitals, and these were qualitative interviews by 20 oncologists who were a very diverse bunch. Some of the big themes that emerged were that balancing grief over losing patients or anticipating losing patients didn't really help with this concept of detachment that many oncologists, and I would say many care providers generally, feel that they have to have in order to move from one patient to the next. More than half of them reported feelings of failure, self-doubt, sadness, and powerlessness. And a third talked about feelings of guilt and insomnia and cried often alone. In the same study, another set of themes that emerged was that these physicians felt that grief was considered shameful, weak, and unprofessional, which is why hiding grief is common, which is why the young physician in 2015 wept outside the hospital for the loss of a 19-year-old. They perceived compartmentalization as necessary to protect themselves from being so sad that they couldn't continue to care for other patients. And what I really like about this paper is that they refer to a concept of disenfranchised grief, which was actually not a term I was familiar with until I started doing some research for this presentation. And this is a type of grief that people experience when they incur a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. And that's a concept that Kenneth Doka came up with. The impact of disenfranchised grief is tremendous. Half of these physicians distanced and withdrew from patients as their patients got closer to dying and probably needed their physicians even more. The effects of grieving impacted the oncologists' personal lives in a multitude of ways. And this need to normalize death and grief as part of both life and medical practice was something that also emerged from this paper and that I thought a lot about after reading it. And I want to go back to this concept of ritual. When we don't have a place to put our most complex feelings, then how do we process them? And there are some rituals that I think are really important for care providers, such as Schwartz rounds and debriefs after code blues, which happen in some institutions. But I don't know that the ongoing process of grief, which, as we talked about earlier, really is a slow unfolding throughout a period of time. I'm not sure that one or two rituals alone really helps us to deal with the complexity of what comes up for us as we grieve or reflect on the past. So, what are rituals? They're a sequenced series of events performed at a given occasions. They can be weddings or baptisms, funerals, or the tending of the dead body in a particular way. Rituals also give us a place to work out our most complex emotions, be they joy or sorrow. And a long time ago, when I read Eat, Pray, Love, I remembered this section, which I wanted to offer here. This is what rituals are for. We do spiritual ceremonies as human beings in order to create a safe resting place for our most complicated feelings of joy or trauma, so that we don't have to haul those feelings around with us forever, weighing us down. We all need such places of ritual safekeeping. So in the absence of formal rituals to process what we see as care providers, particularly now, being on the forefront of COVID, what are things we can do for ourselves? Can literature and writing help? Some evidence does suggest that journaling and writing helps with coping with grief. It's often used as part of different forms of therapy. Writing, something I think about, especially when I wrote about that patient that I coded in residency, I found it to be a forced articulation of what's in our heads to nobody but ourselves at first. I also think that this last stage of grief, which David Kessler defined as meaning making, is a really important lens through which we can approach reading and writing as forms of ritual and processing grief. We know that writing and exposure to the medical humanities can help protect empathy in medical students, but we don't know a lot about self-empathy or how we honor and process our emotions, particularly grief, in medical, nursing, and other training. Writing can take many forms. It can be journaling. It can be letters that we write to ourselves, to a loved one we've lost, to a patient we've lost. It can just be snapshots of days and scenes and words and phrases that come to us. The power of literature and looking to written work as a lens through which we can approach our grief is that the best writers connect the personal and the universal. So you might be reading a book about how someone processed the loss of their father, but you may identify many of the struggles that author went through with the loss of a father that reflect your own losses when you care for a patient or are overwhelmed by a number of patients you can't help in the way you used to be able to before COVID. And the question I started to ask myself is, can writing become a ritual for care providers, particularly now when we may not have the support from our hospitals or sometimes each other to process grief together? So we have another poll at this time. Stephanie, take it away.
Sure, let's get it launched, first of all. And so we're just curious about how this all resonates with you. So of all of you on the line, have you ever used therapeutic reading and writing to explore your own feelings of grief or loss? And maybe you didn't necessarily intend it to be therapeutic, but it was in some way nonetheless. So we'd love to know what all of you think. Thank you for your answers. Simple yes or no. No, I think we might be preaching to the choir here, Dr. Puri. We'll take a look at the results and see what we've got. All right, we'll give it 5 more seconds. Anyone else want to weigh in? That's great. Okay, let's launch our results. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. That's really great to see. So 80% of people have used therapeutic reading and writing to explore feelings of grief or loss, and about 20% have not. Excellent. So I hope what I'm offering here will be a slightly different take on some of the writing practices you may have done. I hope it's not repetition of what you already know. Okay. See. So I just wanted to give all of you a moment to just write 2 sentences or 1 or 3 describing a person or a situation you are grieving or struggling with. And anyone who may want to share their sentences can do so in the chat box, and we'll just read a few of the responses.
And Dr. Puri, I just want to clarify for everyone out there that it's the questions pane that you'll need to enter your sentences in, not to interrupt everyone's thinking, but just to make sure it's clear.
So I see a few people have entered some responses. It took a while, I think, to sort of get going on this. But let me read some of these to you, Sunita. One person writes about the loss of saying goodbye to people the last time that they saw them, children, the events at school, sports with kids. So many memories have been lost. Another person writes about a son who's turning 30 today and has serious mental illness, has been hospitalized many times in the last 8 months. Another person has written about a former coworker who passed away recently from complications of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness. hospital found out today that one of our beloved coworkers passed away, someone who worked in Central Supply, who brought a smile and cheer to us every day. It's a huge loss for us.
Yeah.
Not being able to share physical touch,
Yeah.
ability, just as on and on. Here, I'll just read one more maybe. I sit alone at my kitchen table and I cry, not because I'm worried about getting sick, not because I'm afraid, not because I suspect this man will die soon despite our best efforts to save him, which he does the following day. I cry because although I earnestly believe I did my best for him, from a healthcare standpoint, I can't recall whether I'd shown him any kindness.
Wow.
Mm.
Wow. Thank you all so much for submitting those. I actually started to tear up a little bit when you read the last one.
Mm-hmm.
All of these are they resonate so deeply with me, and I'm hoping with all of the people on this line. And everything you're saying, these permutations of grief are so important to hold. And I wish I could ask everybody who wrote these sentences whether it felt how they felt after putting this on paper. But that's something we can put a pin in and return to. But thank you again for sharing. Those were beautiful and heartfelt and also really very sad.
Mm.
When I've done this exercise in other situations, some of the sentences that people have come up with included, he died, I'm exhausted, and I feel like I failed him. This was from an ICU physician. A hospitalist said, I'll never forget her husband's scream over Zoom. She was beautiful, vibrant, and my age, and I don't know why I couldn't save her. I haven't slept for days. An ER physician said his name was Simon and he was only 35 and he died alone in my ER. He was one of the new COVIDs who came in all at once and he looked stable until he suddenly crashed. I don't know how to live with myself. I've done so much training, but I was totally unable to help him. And an oncologist wrote, my longtime patient is in the COVID ICU and I can't even go into the room to see him. This is totally out of control and there's nothing I can do to help him. So these feelings of powerlessness, these feelings of grieving what we could do in the past that may not be possible now, the feeling of failing our patients because we were just not equipped for this virus, and all the permutations of sadness and sorrow in these words and yours, they're so universal. When we think about when I teach writing as a reflection, what I try to tell people is if being a caretaker or loved one is all about control and bearing witness to suffering to heal another, then really when we sit down to write, it's all about letting go of inhibition. It's all about letting go of the stiff upper lip, of the order and control that we all try to have. It's just about feeling rather than thinking. And you just keep moving forward. It's not the time to edit, it's the time to just let the writing be. You can do this in letters, stream of consciousness, responding to prompts. And we're trying here to really undo our impulses as care providers and just be humans with a pen in our hand and a page before us and a thought in our mind that might make us feel even a tiny bit better when we get it out of our head and onto paper. When we start this process, as Joan Didion shows us in this passage from the Year of Magical Thinking, we may not have the words at first. We may not know who we are writing to or for, but the words come when they can, and we can refine them over time as our perspective on an event changes. So in the opening to the Year of Magical Thinking, she writes, life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on Microsoft Word file reads May 20th, 2004, 11:11 p.m. But that would have been a case of opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I had made no changes to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004 a day or two or three after that fact. For a long time, I wrote nothing else. And the year of magical thinking is all about how she processed the very sudden loss of her husband of, I think, 45, maybe more years, when he had a sudden massive heart attack as he was sitting at the dinner table. But here we see, we may not know the words at first. This is a writer of incredible magnitude, and all she could write was 4 phrases or sentences and had to return back to them over and over again before she could find the words to unpack those sentences. My initial sentences, when I finally sat down and tried to write about the patient who I had coded, were, why did I code him for that long? Why did I even offer a code? I know being angry won't bring him back, but I can't stop. I want a do-over and I won't have one. He's dead, dead in the worst possible way because of me. Raina Maria Rilke, who is a poet I deeply love, wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, try to live the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. And I had read letters from a young poet, or letters to a young poet around this time. And I knew that all I would have for a long time were the questions. And what would it look like to live the questions when we don't have the answers? In A Grief Observed, which is a beautiful book by C.S. Lewis, he really explores the terrain of grief because of the loss of his wife. There's not nearly as much writing by physicians or other care providers about the grief we carry when we lose patients or when circumstances prevent us from doing our best work. I wish there were more. But in the words of those like C.S. Lewis who have written about personal loss, we may find some comfort. An odd byproduct of my loss, he writes, is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. Some funk it all together. R has been avoiding me for a week. Perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated in special settlements like lepers. So those who feel alone in grief sometimes feel even more alone because people don't know what to say to comfort them, and many may avoid them altogether. This is the terrain of isolation and disconnectedness that came with the whole world not realizing what he lost. That's the terrain that C.S. Lewis explored. And as the study I had quoted above suggests, part of what makes care providers' grief that much more difficult is the isolation in which we experience it. Henry Marsh is a British writer who's written a couple of books, and the first one was Do No Harm. And he kind of consoled me and prompted me to rethink so many events in patient cares over the past few years, more so than many of my discussions with colleagues. Here he writes, few people outside medicine realize that what tortures doctors most is uncertainty, rather than the fact that they often deal with people who are suffering or who are about to die. It is easy enough to let somebody die if one knows beyond doubt that they can't be saved. If one is a decent doctor, one will be sympathetic, but the situation is clear. This is life, and we all have to die sooner or later. It is when I do not know for certain whether I can help or not, or should help or not, that things become so difficult. His words here might be specific to his viewpoint as a doctor, but all of us in healthcare and in life struggle with uncertainty, particularly now amid COVID. As you hear me read this paragraph, just for yourselves, jot down 2 or 3 words or sentences that come to mind, and you don't have to share this time. Another book that looks really at the anger and bargaining phases of grief as well as depression is a beautiful book by Elizabeth Tova Bailey called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. And she suffered a really mysterious neurologic illness that left her bedbound, and she talks about her relationship with a snail that showed up unexpectedly in a potted plant next to her bed. When the body is rendered useless, the mind still runs like a bloodhound along well-worn trails of neurons, tracking the echoing questions, the family of whys, whats, and whens, and the impossibly distant kin, how. The search is exhaustive, the answers elusive. Sometimes my mind went blank and listless. At other times it was flooded with storms of thought, unspeakable sadness, and intolerable loss. And in another passage, later in the book, she comes to reflect on her anger, her bargaining, her depression, her sorrow as something that might connect her to the larger human experience of those emotions. My bed was an island within the desolate sea of my room, yet I know there were other people homebound from illness or injury, scattered here or there throughout rural towns and cities around the world. As I lay there, I felt a connection to all of them. We too were a colony of hermits. So even amidst her inconsolable grief and search for answers, she still manages to find a connection to those she can't see or talk to, but those she knows exist. And even in grief, she shows us that through her writing, she can still use these reflections to connect to millions of invisible people suffering, just like herself. And this is something that I think I know, at least for myself, I've often forgotten, that the helplessness, the grief that I've experienced caring for patients, that my team has experienced caring for patients, not just in COVID, but even beforehand, these are not griefs that we suffer alone. And sometimes even coming to that realization can be a form of alleviation of suffering. And when we turn to this idea of meaning making in grief, that sort of pushing back against disenfranchised grief, something that came to mind was part of the prologue for Cheryl Strayed's really excellent novel, Torch. Torch is the result of my first sustained effort at digging. When I scratched beneath the surface as I wrote Torch, I came to understand that I didn't know what I was going to find as each layer revealed itself. It was only after I'd finished that I could see what I'd done. Written a novel not only about grief and loss, but also about love in its many forms, about how we find light in the midst of the most, profound darkness, and how we survive when we think we will not. And just as Bailey was able in the prior slides to ultimately derive connection from what initially felt like complete isolation, the best writers, when we read them, they can show us through their stories that grief is as much an expression of loss as it is an excavation of loss. And though she is most famous for writing her memoir Wild, this novel is where Cheryl Strayed first sought to understand her mother's death at 39 and how it broke apart the very family she had hoped would be united in grief. And she instead examines how the loss of the mother in this family that had held the family together led to its undoing, each of its members unable to connect to the others through a common experience of loss. They each processed their loss differently and split into multiple directions. I believe she wrote this in the introduction to explain what it was like to dig beneath her memories of losing her mother and the painful aftermath, and discovered that beneath grief and loss, we find so much more. It was reading Torch back when I was in residency that actually helped me to think about what was beneath my grief and my anger directed at myself when I couldn't help patients in the ways I thought I could. And this is the power of reading as ritual. It can take us to the place of deepest sorrows and show us that even there in the depths, there is life and there is light. When I started writing my book, I tried very hard to write a section about how I handled the situation of my patient, but I just couldn't. I was getting in my own way, and so I decided to just write from my heart, not write for an audience. And what I found there, as Cheryl Strayed showed me, was that beneath all the anger, self-hatred, and sadness that came up when I thought about him was the need for me to find a way to forgive myself and move on. This was the light in the bottomless sea of my own grief, which I couldn't see until I'd processed it the only way I knew how. And here's what I wrote. 2 hours later, my hands compressed his chest. Blood spurted out of the tube connecting him to the ventilator, and I was doing everything to him but nothing for him. The code was bloody, long, and suddenly over. I've blamed myself for so many years for how he died, in his own blood and shit, utterly alone. I've carried guilt and the grief for so long, but has it helped me? Has it made me a better doctor? Has it made me a better person? What should I do with all of my feelings? All of it was my way of grieving, and I had nowhere to put these feelings. So today I'm going to bury a flower in the ground for him and forgive myself, finally. And when we come full circle here, as Royka wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, perhaps then someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. Thank you so much, and I will take questions now.
Oh, thank you so much, Sunita. That was just incredibly beautiful. I'm just trying to sort of control my own emotions. I know I began writing too, when I was an intern because I had no place to put anything and no way to really process all of the suffering that I felt completely unprepared to bear witness to. And so I have continued that helpful habit. There were some beautiful things, shared in that chat pane after you invited people to write a little bit about what they were thinking and feeling, and just so poignant and so profound. I'm just wondering how you help people day to day in this process. How do you make it work as you're just moving through your day? Do you work on this with your team? Do you invite people or others that you're working with to write? How do you involve people in this process?
So that's a wonderful question. And I think that if I had more bandwidth, I would invite a lot more people to a group, right? And maybe that's something that I need to do starting ASAP. What I do is when I'm working with patients, I often ask them if they journal. So I try to make it a part of my practice when patients are really, really struggling with emotion over a new diagnosis, over, what may be coming for them. And I will recommend particular books to those who like to read. And I will recommend journaling to a lot of them. I've also recommended journaling to some of my colleagues who have really struggled with losing a patient or with having a confrontation with the family or just feeling alone and burned out. I've given away copies or mailed copies to families of the book H is for Hawk, which I think is an absolutely stunning memoir by Helen MacDonald about how she dealt with the aftermath of her father's sudden death. And so I offer reading and writing pretty consistently to my patients, especially those in my clinic. But to make it a practice that includes everybody in the hospital, I think has been a challenge logistically, but maybe now is the time for me to take that on. I try whenever I can if I'm upset about something, and it often happens on the way back home in my car, I have a bunch of like receipts, the best things to write on when you're driving or at a stoplight. And I just jot down some of the phrases that I want to remember, the details I want to remember and process in greater depth later. So I do try to make it a part of my practice. This may only happen once a week or so, but it does happen, and it makes me really reflect on why I feel the way I do and how I can move through it. So it's not detaching from the emotions, but it's allowing them to be so that I can move on to the next patient with a little more peace.
Yes. It's interesting. There are many questions here that I'm going to offer up to you. And again, there are people asking about how to use writing as a tool in debriefings or as exercises for interdisciplinary teams to stimulate discussion and processing. Do you have thoughts about that?
Definitely. I think, back in fellowship when I had a resident and sometimes a medical student, and we were processing or talking about some of the tough things we were bearing witness to, I would often conduct debriefings by offering a line or two, usually from a poem, and just asking everybody in the room to jot down, just like we did, a few sentences about what immediately came to mind. Because what immediately comes to mind, I believe, is really the heart of what we're experiencing. When we start to think too much when we're writing more than those initial 2 or 3 sentences, that's where our impulse as care providers to be controlling, to want to pick the right word, that's when that kicks in. But the first 2 sentences in response to something offered up, not as my own thought, but as a thought from a poet or a few lines from a book, I have found that to be a really nice a way to organize a debrief. I do like the model of debriefing after a difficult patient death in a formal way, particularly in the ICU, where right now they are just going from one patient to another. So to be, I think, part of especially what our social workers and spiritual care providers can do is to offer having a debrief once a week, for example. Because my experience is also that since many of us are socialized to just keep the stiff upper lip and keep going and deal with things later, the teams themselves may not reach out. But how amazing would it be to have one of us reach out to the team and say, hey, I know you're going through a lot. I'm going to bake some brownies and somehow get them to you. And then maybe over Zoom, we'll have this debrief. And I think organizing it either from a specific situation or from a few lines from a book or poem or a scene from a movie, I think that can really bring people together in a way that you're responding to something that you're all hearing or experiencing, be it a patient issue or lines from something really beautifully written.
There's so many questions here. Thank you, Sunita. There's so many questions about how to make writing a real honest to goodness ritual.
Yes. That's a great question. And I think part of what it means to have a ritual, many rituals are public rituals, weddings, funerals, things like that. But you can really do rituals for yourself. That is a conversation between you and the page before you. And part of an individual ritual means committing to it either on a daily or weekly basis and being okay with what comes on the page and what may not come on the page. You may have a ritual time that's your weekly ritual time that you have nothing to say. And that's okay too. The words may just not come at first. But part of what I do when I'm just journaling things that happen during the day is to actually make it a formal ritual. So for me, I make sure my dog and cats are entertaining themselves, they're not with me. I'll usually light a candle or do something that it signifies I am doing this to create space for myself. And then I just write, or sometimes I don't write, depending on what's going on. But I think to make a formal ritual with a group of people can be challenging in these times, especially since we have to do so much over Zoom. I absolutely still think it's worth it. And sometimes logging on to Zoom may be a part of a ritual that defines it. And although we're on Zoom for a lot of things, I would encourage people to think about gatherings on Zoom or however, even if it's being physically present and socially distanced, have something that really marks that time as ritual time, be it playing a song before you start writing every time, lighting a candle if you're doing it individually. But part of what it means to do a ritual is to be consistent in what you're doing, no matter what the outcome of that time.
There's so many comments here thanking you, Sunita, about and people realizing, I didn't even know I was grieving.
Yeah.
People talking about just, realizing how much loss they've actually really suffered.
Yep.
And then one person has said, now, how do you know when you've actually completed the cycle of grief, or does that never happen? So I'm not sure if they were asking you to put on your palliative care hat here.
Yeah. Happy to put that hat on. So I think grief is such an individual experience, and with losses of the magnitude of losing, a patient you've known for 15 years in primary care practice, or losing a parent, or losing a child or a sibling, I think the specific situation and your relationship to the loss can often shape how long you grieve and how you grieve. I am of the opinion, just having walked families to the deathbed of their loved ones, that sometimes the grief never leaves us because the person and the memories generally never leave us. So it could be that you cycle through different phases of grief and feel like you're at a good place one day. And then the next day, you may be cleaning up your house and find an old photo, and the cycle begins again. I really believe that grief is a series of waves, and you will have times of stability and you will have times where nothing can console you. And that is completely human and completely normal. And I think when grief ends, I don't know that it ever ends. I think it just manifests itself in different ways. And that's kind of what I talk about with my families who ask me, how am I going to bear this? I don't know if I have it in me to lose whoever it is that they love, or my colleagues who say, I cannot be part of this goals of care conversation because I just can't talk about death with the patient that I really care for a lot. And I tell them the same, pretty much what I just said, that it's okay to grieve. You'll grieve in your own way. We all have our ways. And the hope is that over time, the intensity and frequency of those cycles subsides. That's always the hope. But I think remembering that you're human, and it's going to take, your grief is going to take a very unique form because you are who you are, and your relationship to the person you lost, or your relationship to a situation like being overwhelmed in the ER, is uniquely you. And so I've never seen, in the time I've practiced palliative care, any grief that has completely matched another grief. So it will be as unique as your fingerprint. And part of what it means to move through grief, I really believe, is having a place to put and work out those feelings, be it a ritual you come up with by yourself. I've heard of people, picking the petals off of a rose and throwing it into a river on a consistent basis to try to let go of some of their emotions, or people throwing rocks into the sea. We have a sea, we have easy access to a sea out here in Los Angeles, but wherever you are, there's probably a nearby body of water, even if it's a swimming pool, although you may not want to throw rocks into a swimming pool. But whatever it is that helps you over time to have a relationship to your grief so that it's not unfamiliar and strange to you. I hope that wasn't too theoretical, but But that's kind of how I think about grief.
No, I think it was just such a truth. You know, we all experience this in such unique ways, as you said, as uniquely as our fingerprints.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I hate to end this webinar, Sunita. It's been an absolute joy to listen to you and to also read the comments of our participants and our listeners out there. So I just want to thank you so much, and to thank everybody who was listening in and commenting throughout this webinar. We really appreciate it. And I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to close us out.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks so much, Dr. Puri, as well. This one definitely struck a chord for our audience. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to say that we have another webinar next week. We hope that you will join us for. We have Susan David coming back again. Some of you know we had some technical issues with her a few weeks ago, so we're thrilled that she'll be rejoining us, and it feels like a good time as any to think about emotional agility and how we can manage this phase of the COVID crisis. So we hope you'll join us. We'll be sending you an invitation. We'll also be posting the slides from today's presentation with the recording tomorrow on our website, and we will send all of you a link to that. Last but not least, as we wrap up today, I want to invite everyone to think about joining us for our virtual Compassion in Action conference starting next month. We'll have a several month-long series of workshops, panels, and speakers twice weekly. We hope you'll join us. We will have scholarships available, so take a look if that's of interest to you at compassioninactionconference.org. And that's about it for today. We know everyone's busy. Again, if you could take a minute to fill out our survey, we'd appreciate it. And if you'd like to learn more about the Schwartz Center and the work we're doing, please follow us on social media and take a look at our website. Thank you again for joining us here today. We hope we'll see you again, and please be well.